Thanks, Mahima, and good afternoon to you all. It's a pleasure to see so many of you joining us today. As Mahima said, my name is Gronya. I'm the Education Coordinator at the Classical Association. This is the second session in our joint webinar series with the HA, and today we are going to attempt perhaps the impossible and to give a whistle-stop tour of Greek history in just over an hour. I'm indebted to my co-speakers, my panelists this afternoon. We have Steve Maston from the Historical Association. We have the absolutely brilliant Professor Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones from Cardiff University, James Renshaw, who joined us for the first webinar from Godolphin and Latimer School in London, and Emma Beetham from York College. We are all on Twitter, so if you have Twitter, you can tweet and follow us along. That would be great. Today's session, we are going to cover four key topics. James is going to kick us off with the birth of history and historiography before we pass over to Lloyd, who's going to give us an introduction to ancient Persia. Emma is going to talk about two of the key Greek city-states, Sparta and Athens, before Steve finishes up today's session talking about Alexander the Great. We will take questions throughout today's webinar. Please do leave any comments or queries in the chat, and then also be some time at the end to ask any final questions that you have. So, not to waste any time, given that we've got to try and cram so much in, James, I'm going to hand over to you to get us started. Oh, James, you're muted.
Okay, schoolboy error there to start us off, as usual. Yeah, I'm going to start by thinking, as I just try and share my screen. I shouldn't try and multitask. Let's see if I can do that. And hopefully all the viewers give me thumbs up, my co-leaders. So can you see? There we go. Fantastic. Okay, so Greek history 101, I think probably needs to start with this word history, and why for any historian really anywhere in the world is ancient Greek history so interesting and so important. And it's really because of these two guys that we're looking at here. It's perhaps hyperbole to talk about the birth of history, but it might not be hyperbole to talk about the birth of historiography, a debate, a discussion about what it is to record and analyze and understand the past. And when we think about the first two great Greek historians, we think about Herodotus. You can see the details for him here, and Thucydides. And each of them talks about a very, very major conflict. The first one, Herodotus, the first conflict is what we call the Persian Wars, you can see here, which is sort of technically 499 to 479 BC. But Herodotus makes very clear at the start that he wants to go back about 2 or 3 generations and trace how we got to that moment in 499. Notice as well that he's born actually not in what we might think of as Greece today, but in modern Bodrum, Halicarnassus. And so actually he's born into a part of the world that was ruled by the Persians. And then about a generation or so later, we have Thucydides. We can't, it's very hard with ancient figures often to have precise dates, but he's born about 25 years later. We know he tells us very much he's an Athenian. And his war is the Peloponnesian War, or what has come to be called the Peloponnesian War. It is the conflict between Athens and Sparta, and as leaders of respective power blocks. And he is very interested in how that war breaks out and how it develops. So all of that gives you a little bit of a context. But you might say, well, so what? Well, they're very different. And Thucydides, as we'll have a look at, is really explicit at the start that he wants to be different, he doesn't want to be like Herodotus. He's got issues with the way that Herodotus does history. And that in itself, if you like, is a really early example of a very, very lively debate about what it is to do history. What is a good historian? And I think that's very exciting for your students to be faced with that question right at the start in Greek history. So a bit more about Herodotus. There he is. Named by Cicero, the Roman, as the father of history. And I think one of the things that I love about him is that he really does He's a Renaissance man. He's interested in all peoples. Now, he makes lots of mistakes. He absorbs lots of Greek ideas about foreign peoples, which are perhaps pejorative. But I think we can say in his defense, he has a genuine interest in the world and in the peoples of the world. This is something which is part of a wider culture in ancient Greece. Herodotus stands really in a tradition of a scientific revolution, where people are starting to come up with rationalist scientific explanations for phenomena. Rather than saying the gods caused the lightning or the rain, they're trying to understand that scientifically. This is exactly the same era where Democritus comes up with the idea of the atom, the basic building block of life. And so coming up with a rationalist explanation for the world around us is part of the culture at this time. And we know very little really about any predecessors to Herodotus as historians or of anything of that type, but we do know names of people who, the technical name for them is logographers, people who talk about local cities, local traditions, other ethnicities, other groups, geographies of the world, people who might be early social scientists. What we don't really know is the extent to which they were doing history in the sense of trying to analyze the past rather than just recording things. So Herodotus stands in that tradition. He also stands in a tradition where the world is moving slightly away from poetry being the received form of literature and of engaging in high culture. He is the first great prose writer that we have, certainly in the Western tradition. So his introduction, I think, is very important. Just trying to get it all up on my screen here. We get Herodotus of Halicarnassus here shows forth his inquiry, and that Greek word inquiry, I've put it in there, historiae, that, if you like, is the moment that the word history is coined. In ancient Greece at this time, it means sort of research, inquiry, looking into stuff. And so our words story and history have evolved really from this moment, if you like. And then he goes, he wants to record human achievements so they don't get lost in time, great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some by barbarians. So whatever his faults as a historian, he's interested in the achievements of other civilizations as well. And I think that is interesting and important. And then this crucial thing, he wants to explain not just what happened, but he wants to analyze why it happened. And that's really the first time that in the Western tradition, at least, that we have someone who tries to do that. He's also a fabulous read, so I would really encourage you. In the first webinar, we talked a bit about the rise of Persia. We talked a bit about the Cyrus cylinder, and he steps it back really about 2 or 3 generations, as I said, which historians today, anthropologists will say that is where the kind of communal memory starts to disappear after 3 generations. So he's bang on with that. And he traces that story of Cyrus, the rise of Persia, which Lloyd will talk a bit more about. He himself, as I said, born within the Persian Empire. What about his technique, his method? Well, he doesn't tell us an awful lot, but there are moments where he says things. He talks about using, up until this is when he's in Egypt, and one of his 9 books is all based in Egypt. He uses his own observation, judgment, and research. Pretty good skills to go with. But then he says, and then I report the words of the Egyptians. And this is a really important thing. A lot of his history, a lot of his research is oral, by speaking to people. And trying to record them. And 2 other quotes which expand on that, the idea of relating traditions that have been related to him. And he says in the last quote, I don't have to believe this. I'm just writing down what people tell me. Sometimes he indicates what his preferences are for which version he believes, and sometimes he leaves it up to us. He's certainly shaping his narrative in the way that he wants to. So again, ideas of historiography here. Well, we're going to jump forward about 50 years and think about Thucydides here. He, right from the start, he sets himself out to be different from Herodotus. He doesn't use that word historia. That's far too much of a Herodotean word. The implication is, I'm going to do this properly, none of this Herodotus stuff. And so he says he wrote the war. That's how he introduced it. He didn't write the history of the war between the Peloponnesians and Athenians. And then he says, and it's partly because it was going to be the greatest war ever and the most worthy of recording. So this is a much better war than the Persian Wars to write about. So there's a lot of competition. And he is talking about a world after the Persian Wars where the Greeks have split really into two power blocks. You have the Spartans in cherry and the Athenian Empire, the Spartan Empire in cherry and the Athenian Empire in yellow, with the Persians still looming very large and a few other neutralish states as well. So his war is very much, if you like, a Greek civil war. They're all independent states, but it's a cultural and ethnic civil war, we might say. There's a lot of text here, but he does go into a lot of detail about his historical method early on. And again, it's really different. It's different from what we would expect today. And he says very clearly, either I was present myself at the events which I've described, or else I spoke to someone who was. So that he's almost like a kind of a journalist, really, a war reporter. And he says, even then, if I spoke to someone, it's difficult to work out what was going on. People remember things. They tell you things which, out of partiality, out of subjectivity. And so it's really hard to get to the truth. And then he says, my history is not going to be romantic. And that's a real thumbing his nose at Herodotus, I think. And then he sort of says, the reason I'm doing this is that history kind of repeats itself, or similar things will happen again in the future and have happened in the past. So people can learn. I'm not doing this for the now, I'm doing it forever. And here we are talking about it. So he's kind of succeeded. He talks about speeches as well. So just when we thought he was very forensic, very scientific, actually he admits he kind of makes them up depending on what he thinks might have been said if he doesn't know himself. So we have to be careful again. That was very accepted in the Greek tradition. Sorry, I will come back there. So Herodotus, Thucydides, until very recently, within the historical community, has been much better regarded. He was the guy who was doing the facts. He's not interested in the gods, unlike Herodotus. He's much more scientific. He's much more about facts. That has changed a little bit in the last 20 years or so, quite a lot, actually. Thucydides is very blokish. It's very war and politics. Herodotus, I think about a third of his named characters are women. We have very few women in Thucydides. So they both have strengths, they both have faults, as do we all. But it is a wonderful starting point and discussion point, the difference, the vast difference between the two of them with your students. And this is why we do Greek history, because they gave us the words history and historiography, which just means the writing down of history. Thank you. Oh, now I'll try stopping sharing. There we go. Any questions?
Yeah, do we have any questions before we hand over to Lloyd? If you do have questions as they crop up, please do use the chat and we can field them as they come through. Lloyd, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to share my screen now as well. So here we go. All okay? You can see that, guys? Yeah. Yeah, great, fantastic. All right, well, what I thought I would do in this, given that in the first webinar, you spoke a little about Cyrus the Great and the importance of the Cyrus cylinder, is just to think about how you might approach using ancient Persian history with your students and drawing ancient Persian history into the more contemporary world. One thing I always say to my students in ancient history at Cardiff University is that ancient history is not a dead subject. It's alive, it's vital, it is having impact on us today. And the historical process is very much alive there. So what I want to do in this very, very brief talk is to introduce you to the idea behind the Cyrus cylinder and how that cylinder, that major source for Persian history, has been used and abused by successive generations, both within Iran and outside of Iran, in the hope that you might be able to see here segues that the way in which you might be able to take ancient materials and combine them or contrast them with more contemporary pieces as well, always then with the rubric that ancient history is not a dead subject. So this is the cylinder. As you'll know, it's a very standard Babylonian form of decree. It's not even Persian, it is Babylonian. It's very specifically Babylonian. It talks about how Cyrus, very often in the first person, he speaks about how he liberates the Babylonians from their corvée labor under the wicked previous king Nabonidus, and the god Marduk chooses him to be his champion as well. It is very, very standard Babylonian piece of rhetoric. There's nothing new in it whatsoever. However, what's really fascinating about the cylinder is the way in which it has been thought of over hundreds and hundreds of years. You could begin the whole process, in fact, by looking at Cyrus's appearance in Xenophon, the Greek historian. You could look at him in Chaucer, where he appears. You could look at him on the stage in the Elizabethan period. Cyrus appears then, or even the founding fathers of America. Jefferson in particular was very enamored of Cyrus. But I want to show you this image here. This is an English language history of Persia that's been published in Iran. It's also available in Farsi. And what's really interesting is the way that they promote the Cyrus cylinder to students in Iran today, where they call it, as you can see from the bottom there, the text of the Human Rights Charter issued by Cyrus the Great. And a myth has arisen really amongst Iranians since the 1950s that this cylinder encodes a kind of act of freedom, the basic source of all human rights. And you can see that in this image here from the same book in Farsi and in English, that Cyrus holds up this cylinder almost like the Magna Carta. It's a charter for freedoms. Now, in no way, shape or form does the Cyrus cylinder talk about freedoms whatsoever. Cyrus certainly talks about liberating people from corvée labor, but never in terms of what we might see as individual freedoms. That's an absolute anathema, really, to the ancient world. It's something that they would never have understood. But what's interesting here is how deep this idea, this myth of Cyrus the freedom giver and the cylinder itself goes into the modern psyche. So in the early 1960s, a copy, a facsimile of the Cyrus cylinder was made by the last Shah of Iran and was donated to the United Nations. And if you go into the lobby of the United Nations building in New York today, you'll see this facsimile of the cylinder taking pride of place in a display case with its original certificate or gift from the Shah, and a translation of elements of the cylinder. The cylinder itself, of course, is now in the British Museum, has been there since its finding in the 1870s. But that doesn't mean that the Iranians haven't wanted to have it back, even though, as I say, it's actually found in Iraq and not Iran. It has nothing really to do with Iran, apart from the creator of it, the person who commissioned it. In 2009, the Iranians did have an extended loan of the cylinder and put it on display in the National Museum of Iran in Tehran. It attracted thousands upon thousands and thousands of Iranians who came to see it. And the way in which it was marketed amongst the Iranians was very clear, like this: Cyrus, king of Persia, who declared the first Charter of Human Rights in 538 and created the first multicultural society. Well, certainly the Persian Empire was vast and incorporated at least 32 what we would now call nation states. But whether it was multicultural or not, of course, is open to debate. And this is something that you could encourage your students to talk about. What is multicultural? How far can we trace this back? More importantly, outside of the National Museum, this plaque was laid down, which again emphasizes that Cyrus the Great issued the first Declaration of Human Rights. And he goes on to say in 4 paragraphs. I declare, this is supposed to be the Cyrus cylinder, I will respect the tradition, customs, and religion of the nations of my empire, and never let my governors look down or insult the inhabitants of my nations. I hereby abolish slavery. If anyone opposes others, should it happen, I will take his or her right and penalize oppressors. Today, I declare freedom of religion. All are free to choose any religion, live in regions, and take up any job, provided that they never violate others' rights. These proclamations ring true today in our times as they did in 538 BC. Well, maybe so, but I can tell you now, you can look in vain at the Cyrus cylinder to find any of that. This is purely a wish list. And one thing that I want to draw your attention to is the fact that there are multiple fake translations of the Cyrus cylinder littered all over the internet. And in and of itself, this could be a really interesting exercise to look at how you can take a source and completely and utterly rework it for your own intentions. And sometimes the intentions are very fine indeed. In about 2003, I think it was, the great peacemaker Shirin Ebadi received her Nobel Peace Prize for the work she'd done on peacekeeping across the Middle East. And she alluded to the Cyrus cylinder in her speech, in which she called it herself one of the great documents of history that should be studied. I agree with that. But then she also said, he promised not to force any person to change religion or faith. And then she quotes from this cylinder, I announce that I will respect the traditions, customs, and religions of the nations of my empire, and never let any of my governors or subordinates look down or insult them, and so forth. What she didn't realize was that her speechwriter, who had put this very important speech together, had actually taken note of one of these bogus translations online and had inserted it into her speech. When she learned this, apparently she was crestfallen because she thought obviously she was doing a great thing there in championing Iran's young Iranians, people's desire for freedoms. This all shows, I think, that the Cyrus cylinder is not a defunct object that's just sitting in a museum case. It really has a potent power behind it. And that has gone on for generations. The last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah, before the revolution, absolutely and utterly linked himself to the vision of Cyrus the Great and of the Achaemenid kings in the banknotes and the coins, for instance, which he had minted during his reign. Not only does he use Islamic Persian art and architecture, but draws conspicuously on Achaemenid, ancient Persian iconography as well, including, you'll see on the 50 rial note there, the tomb of Cyrus the Great. And from 1970 onwards, he began to organize a huge celebration, which took place at the great ancient city of Persepolis and at Pasargadae, Cyrus's center where he is buried, to celebrate 2,500 years of what he called unbroken Persian monarchy. And the symbol of that remarkable event was the Cyrus cylinder, even though, as I say, it was in London. The climax of the whole ceremony took place at the tomb of Cyrus the Great, where in a very hubristic speech to the founder of the Persian Empire, the Shah addressed Cyrus the Great directly, calling him the Shah and Shah, King of Kings, and saying that you are the eternal hero of the Iranian people, the founder of the oldest monarchy in the world, the great freedom giver of the world. He says, we send greetings to you. And then the most hubristic thing of all says, don't worry, Cyrus, sleep in peace, because we are here to look after your inheritance and we will always be here. So he casts himself very much in the mold of Cyrus the Great. And it's interesting to observe how this really brought down the nemesis of the Iranian clergy on the Shah, the Ayatollah Khomeini made a very bold statement saying anyone who participates in these festivals of Cyrus the Great is a traitor to Islam and the Iranian nation. And the ancient title of King of Kings, Shah and Shah, is the most hated title in the eyes of God. And of course, within a few years, the Iranian monarchy had fallen. The Shah was exiled. He died in 1980 in exile in Cairo. And of course, Iran's monarchy disappeared overnight. And in its place, of course, was established this current regime of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the Islamic Republic have a very, very difficult relationship with its pre-Islamic past, the whole world of Cyrus the Great. In one respect, they're very proud of Cyrus for being an Iranian. So from a nationalist point, it's a wonderful thing. However, from a Shia Islam point, of course, he is a pagan and they don't know what to do with him. Nevertheless, after the controversial 2009 election, in which Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was brought back into power basically through a scuppered, an illegal democratic vote, he decided to try to quell the unpopularity of the regime. And he appealed for the British Museum to send the Cyrus cylinder to Tehran, which they did. And even though, of course, at this period, we know that the Iranian regime is one of the most hostile, unfriendly regimes, not only to the West, but also to its own people, he nevertheless trumpeted the cylinder as being, I quote here, talking about Iran is not talking about a geographical entity or race. Talking about Iran is tantamount to talking about culture, human values, justice, love, and sacrifice, where, of course, human rights are completely and utterly ignored in Iran. Now, he does this in direct opposition to what the rest of Iran seems to be doing. Now, it's important to state that at least 70% of Iranians are under the age of 35. It's one of the youngest demographies in the world. And they have embraced the vision of Cyrus the Great and laud him on this level of being this great freedom giver. Here we see celebrations of the Persian New Year, Nowruz, in about 2012, when people were gathering to have Nowruz picnics. They are throwing flowers on the tomb of Cyrus. And from about 2016, they inaugurated an unofficial celebration of Cyrus every October the 29th, which is Cyrus the Great Day, Freedom Day. This is not endorsed by the Islamic government, but it's become very, very popular amongst the young. And indeed, in the 2009 Green Revolution against Ahmadinejad, they used the Cyrus cylinder as their counter voice to the abuse of the Cyrus cylinder they saw that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad had brought into Iran. And here in Farsi, they call themselves the Young Lions. The tomb, by and large, is standing by itself. This is how I've usually visited it, there's nobody around at all. But it's interesting to note that in 2018, it is assessed that, it's hard to pin down the numbers, but it is assessed that between 100,000 and 300,000 young Iranians gathered at the tomb and circumambulated it, as you would the Kaaba in Iran, shouting out, "Iran is our country, Cyrus is our father, clerical rule is tyranny." Obviously, they're playing on an Islamic tradition, but around this tomb of an ancient Persian king, this idea, of course, of giving the first human rights as well. It's really quite remarkable to see youngsters activating their ancient history as a way of trying to give themselves a sense of identity, a sense of freedom in this very oppressive society. Of course, the lashback was horrific. The Ayatollah Nuri Hamidani, who was an octogenarian, typical of the age of most of the mullahs of the regime now, almost burst a blood vessel when he said, "The Shah used to say, 'O Cyrus, sleep in peace, we are awake.' Now a group of people have gathered around the tomb of Cyrus, and they are circumambulating it and have taken their handkerchiefs out, and they cry, just as they do for Shia Muslim saints Hussein. In the time of Imam Khomeini too, a group of people started commemorating Cyrus. Khomeini said that these people have gathered and are crying because we have brought Islam to this country. These are the same people. They are counter-revolutionaries. I am amazed at the people who got together around the tomb of Cyrus, shouting the same slogans for him that we shout in support of the supreme leader." So there you see, within Iran, this is a highly politicized period of history that we are looking at. And in fact, I myself over the years have seen individual Iranians on their knees in front of the tomb, treating him very much like a saint or even a god king. Now, there's another element to Cyrus's story, which you might be interested in thinking about, in which you could teach your students as well and get them to open debates, and that's Cyrus outside of Iran. And in particular, the relationship that Cyrus the Great has to the history of Israel and the history of the United States of America. We know, of course, that now, since the 1979 revolution, America and Iran are at an absolute impasse, as are Iran and Israel, but it wasn't always that way. And in fact, these images remind me to tell you that in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, Cyrus the Great is the only Gentile, the only non-Jew to receive the title Messiah, God's anointed. And that's, of course, because he liberated the Jews from Babylonian captivity. So he has great press, really, really good press in the Hebrew Bible. And traditionally, the Jews have really embraced Cyrus as being a freedom giver. This was really pushed forward in 1947 to 1949 with the creation of the State of Israel, which was aided and abetted very strongly from the White House by President Truman. Of course, this is his signed autograph saying that he recognizes a new Jewish state has been born. And when in 1953 he was invited to Jerusalem to receive an award for the work he'd done on the recognition of the State of Israel, a minister, an Israeli minister, said to him, "Oh, you know, President Truman, for us, you are like Cyrus the Great." And he said, "What do you mean? I'm like him. I helped to create your state. I am Cyrus. I am Cyrus." He himself, the president, really saw himself as a second Cyrus. And it might be interesting for you to explore with students the idea of how Cyrus and the same image of the Cyrus cylinder is utilized in contemporary Israel today as well. You'd think that there's nothing in common between these two peoples, but in fact, Cyrus is a cement, it is a bond between them. More recently and more disturbingly, we can go back to the United States of America and find amongst right-wing Republican Christians another use of Cyrus the Great, and that is identifying former President Trump as the new Cyrus as well. This comes up all the time. There's a really great work you could do on the web, for instance, about looking at this. There's masses and masses and masses of predictions, this whole kind of thing where Zionist Christians, of course, in America, believe that the end of times will come and hope that this relationship of America, Trump as Cyrus with Israel, will help bring about the end of times, of course. And it's something which is being taken very, very seriously in America at the moment, the idea that Trump is another Cyrus. And also, of course, the moving of the United States embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem has only emphasized once again that this is very much, this part of ancient history is very, very much a reality. So I'll finish with that, just to say then that this is a way that you might want to approach ancient history. If you've not really taught ancient history before and you don't want to delve in too much into too much depth into the ancient sources, there are really good ways that you can think about using ancient sources to think about contemporary or more recent historical events, which you or your students might be more familiar with. To give you one tiny example of this again, next year at Cardiff University, I'm teaching a module on European fascism and classical civilizations, essentially. So that will be everything from architecture through to books and ideologies as well. So hopefully you'll see something of value in doing that. Thanks very much.
That was absolutely brilliant, Lloyd. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I think we have a question from Alf. Alf, if you're there, we're happy for you to unmute if you'd like to ask any questions.
Hi, Alf. How can I help?
I'm afraid we can't hear you, Alf, but please feel free to type your question into the chat if your microphone isn't working.
Okay. All right, Alf, yeah, if you could pop your question into the chat, and I'm sure that we can pick that up at a later point in the today's webinar. But I am going to pass over to Emma now, who is going to talk to us about Sparta and Athens. Thanks, Emma.
Hi, I'm just sorry, I'm just getting myself set up. There I am, and I'll just get my video up. That should all be working now. Hi, so I'm going to be talking about Athens versus Sparta today. There's loads that can be going into this, so this is a really kind of touching on just the really a little bit of an insight into both areas. So I've put up a map, which are the major states of Greece at the time period, which is classical Greece, which is I'm going to be discussing about. I'm hoping that's sharing, and can I have a thumbs up from the panel so I know? Okay, that's great. So this is a map, and you can see that ancient Greece as we know it, or Hellas, is a very fragmented place. You've got lots of states that have their own way of life. They've got their own political systems, from oligarchies to democracies to semi-dual kingship in Laconia, which I'm going to talk about, their own constitutions and their own lifestyles. And because of this, because of the differences, and mentioned in Herodotus and Thucydides, as was mentioned with James earlier, there is conflict within the Greek world throughout the time period that I teach. So the major key states that we're going to be looking at today are Attica and Laconia, where Attica, the polis or the city-state, the capital is Athens, and Laconia is Sparta. These are obviously the two most polar opposite states that we look at within the Greek world, mainly because of their way of lifestyles, the constitution, and because of that, we have the Peloponnesian War that breaks out as one of the main reasons. So what I'm going to be talking about within Sparta, first of all, are the major differences in Sparta, the way of life, how they were indoctrinated, and kind of bring it into relevance for the modern world as well, and how modern history can be often linked back to Sparta and its origins there. So I'm going to start off with, first of all, the idea of Sparta and its lifestyle. So with Sparta as being its unique place, Sparta started to indoctrinate their youth from a very early age. So at birth, once you were born, you were subject to being checked over by the Gerousia or the council. And as you were being checked over, you were checked for any deformities, anything that wasn't near perfect. And if you were to survive at that point, you would then go on to to live with your fellow siblings, etc., until the age of around 7. At 7, you'd go off to the agoge, where you would take part in a state education system, which, as stated by Plutarch in this particular piece of evidence, you formed and followed a prescribed lifestyle. With this prescribed lifestyle, it was mainly viewed themselves as part of their country rather than an individual, and that was what you will learn from the age of 7 in Sparta. And with the final outcome being when you graduated or when you became a citizen or a Spartiate at the age of 30, was that you turned out to be a professional soldier. And it was at that point, as a professional soldier, that was how your prescribed life was to be. At the age of 30, once you were graduated and you became a fully fledged citizen, you continued your education outside of the agoge, outside of their education world, to join in with observing boys, giving them, as it says there from Plutarch, learning from elders constantly in order to think of themselves as an individual, as a state rather than an individual. And in terms of their education and creating themselves as a professional soldier, that was the only thing that the Spartans had as their lifestyle. Everything centered around them becoming the best warrior, the best Spartan, the best soldier that they could be. And this could be in forms of training, general working with their fellow soldiers, and it was constantly about survival tactics, military tactics to prepare themselves for future military duties. And I wanted to compare this to some modern day states, especially Nazi Germany. So you can see here, I've got a picture. So when you're thinking about the relevance of this in the modern world and modern history, I've got this as an example of an 11-year-old boy, as you can see, in the Hitler Youth Organization, learning how to fire a rifle. So if we take this back to and compare it with Sparta, we've got the idea of indoctrination and the idea of the Nazi youth preparing future small children to become future soldiers for Germany. Their activities, just like in Sparta, were centered around physical activities, exercise, to make them strong individuals, to protect the state, to fight for the state, and think of themselves as one with the state rather than an individual. And as well as this being solely centered on boys here, there was a similar experience for women in Sparta as well. Boys and girls were both educated from the age of birth to the age of 6 together until the boys went off to the education system or the agoge. And at that point, girls were educated together with the same idea of having physical education being at the forefront of that. And whereas the forefront for boys was to be soldiers, that was part of the women's training as well, to defend Sparta at times of need, but it was also to have them to be women who were tough, going to endure childbirth, and to make them strong mothers to provide future children for Sparta. Now, if we take a comparison to Nazi Germany as well with that angle, women or girls who were in the Hitler Youth were also being prepared for motherhood, for duties later on. So there is a direct comparison that we can make between Sparta and the Nazi Germany, which Hitler admits that he read Xenophon, his constitution, his works of Sparta, and saw very good ideas that he thought we could use himself, the idea of the Aryan race, etc., which then links to the idea of Spartan discipline, that one of the key things in Sparta was discipline at all times by any citizen. Any punishment, as you can see from Xenophon here, was to be any misconduct to be punished. And he believed that the reason for this was to respect in boys to be higher, that there's nothing better than respect in adults and boys, and this was something to then submit to authority, as with a comparison with Nazi Germany. And going on the idea of the lifestyle and how it was so different to other places, this idea of a prescribed lifestyle, as Xenophon explains it to be, is also seen in their brutality of their treatment of the social structure in Sparta. So in Sparta, it was predominantly based on the idea of, as I've said, a warrior nation. Now, whilst the Spartans were out training and they were becoming the best warriors, the best soldiers, they still needed people to do the day-to-day running of creating crafts, farming, creating food, etc. And that was done by the helots, or the captives that they'd captured from their neighbouring cities, the state of Messenia. And although some of them also came from Laconia as well, these were the basis of their social structure. And in order to keep them in their place and to instill fear within the helots, there was a group of boys known as the Crypteia, who were used within Sparta and within Laconia to go around, as Plutarch states here, where they would be equipped with daggers and basic rations and nothing else. They would go to spots, hide and wait, and then they would murder any helot or slave which they caught. And they would often kill helots that stood out for their physical strength and seemed to be the most threatening for Sparta. Now, the reason being for this is the idea of instilling fear, stopping or preventing potential revolts, which does happen in the year 465 BC, where the helots take the advantage of an earthquake that breaks out. But it's to keep and maintain their lifestyle. Now, this was something that the rest of Greece saw as quite different, looked down upon, frowned upon. That slaves and having slaves within Greece was not an issue, but enslaving their own people who were fellow Greeks, had the same religion, spoke the same language, was something that was not accepted, especially by their rivals Athens, which we're going to come on to later, which is exactly what they do in a sense with their empire. But we can then again make this as a direct comparison to more modern day ideas of totalitarian states, dictatorships, where again I've used the Nazi Party, the SA and the SS as an example here, where the brown shirts or the SA were used in several intimidation, several events by Hitler. For example, Kristallnacht, we've got right at the beginning the Munich Beer Hall Putsch, where you've got people, thugs, going around intimidating those in society that are seen as being different, are seen as being the ones to be targeted. So whilst teaching this, you can often bring it into more modern day history and make direct comparisons to where this has been seen and where it continues to be seen in modern day. So as a direct contrast to Sparta, then we've got Athens. So I've got a map up here of the Athenian Empire at its height. So we're looking at roughly around 454 BC. So you can see there's a little bit of a key there, but we've got Laconia, we've got the whole of the Peloponnese here, Laconia, and then we've got mainland Greece. And you can see the dotted areas are the extent as to where the Athenian Empire manages to extend to, right over to Asia Minor, and all the little states that you can see, islands and the states that you can see there as well. So this being as a comparison versus Sparta, then we can see from here that Athens decides to embark on an imperialistic policy after the year of 481 BC. So in 481 BC, the Hellenic League is created in defense of Greece for the Persian invasion, the second Persian invasion in 480. And at first, it starts out as I suggested, a league where members were seen as being equal. Athens merely was seen as a figurehead and was to do things like collecting money, tribute money, to help with the navy. And at first it starts out as a league of equality. Over time, it turns from a league to an empire, with the emphasis of Athens wanting to spread this democracy that has been the first of its kind in Athens, and the idea that democracy is the best form of government. And this roughly is around in 454, when the treasury, which was used to fund the league, moves to Athens, and from the island of Delos to Athens. Now, with the empire came the notion, as I say, of spreading and promoting democracy to their allies. Now, in cases, this often replaced oligarchies or Persian-inspired tyrannies. And for some, this brought great benefits. So jobs, for example, the poor and underrepresented people were able to have some sort of say, trials, for example, courts. So a lot of it had benefits. However, we see lots of reluctance to the Athenians and their instilling of democracy in lots of states. And often people who didn't want to be part of the empire because of the indoctrination of their policies and because of the harsh treatment, often revolted or left the empire. And as we can see, one of these places was a place called Chalcis, which was on the island of Euboea. And in 446 into 445, they decided that they no longer wanted to be part of the empire due to the harsh treatments that it had to withstand. So one, for example, was having to pay a high amount of money to be part of this empire, which they no longer wanted to be part of. And so they decided to revolt. Now, this was a failed revolt, and the Athenians decided what was to be done with the people that revolted in these cities. And this is in the Acropolis Museum, this stone. Just as a side note, this was taken by one of my students when I went back in March. So they sent me the picture kindly because there's a nice photo that they'd taken. And this was set up on the Acropolis, and it was inscribed to show the Athenians that we are in control. We have an empire. We own these people. We have subjects. But it was also put up in Chalcis to remind them that the Athenians were the dominating city, that it was the Athenians that they owed an oath to, and it was to them they had to be loyal to. So as you can see, this was inscribed and put up, and it says the secretary of the council is to write up this decree and oath at Athens on a stone stele and set up on the Acropolis at the expense of the Chalcedonians. And specifically referenced in this particular piece where it has been inscribed is the fact that they, one, had to obey the Athenians, pay them tribute. But I think most interestingly is that they reference the Athenian courts and the Athenians' trial system. And it states that their officials would be used, as in their court system, in serious matters, so exile, execution. So this indicates that the idea of democracy, or their version of democracy, and everybody was allowed to have a trial, seems to be instilled on the Chalcedonians with this, which shows that they didn't trust their empire, their allies or subjects, to have a government that they felt was efficient, that they felt was fair, and their style of government was the best one to have. And so this was seen in many different places. And this leads to another revolt, which happens in the year 428 BC, where we have another revolt that takes place due to no longer wanting to be part of the Athenian Empire, where we have oligarchs revolting on Lesbos, one of the places, Mytilene, and they decide to rebel because they do not want to be part of the empire anymore. Their idea of Athenian supremacy, the idea of Athenian democracy, the idea of paying money, the idea of tightly being controlled through religion and of Athens was no longer what they wanted to be part of. So in 48, they decide to rebel. Now, what's interesting is to deal with the situation, they do it in a democratic way, which is something that they're saying is a good thing, but the treatment of the people of Mytilene is not so democratic. So a debate breaks out in the assembly over what should happen to the people of the island here. And on one side, we have the argument that all men of military age should be executed and all women and children should be taken into slavery. The other argument is that only the ringleaders should be held accountable. They should all be executed, and will just impose harsher treatments on the island and the place of Mytilene instead. So the debate takes place, and Cleon, who is one of the generals one of the 10 generals at the time, his argument of all men of military age to be killed, women and children into slavery wins. So the Athenians go home, male citizens who went to the assembly and could vote, and they reconvened the next day because they realised that maybe this idea of such a harsh treatment maybe wasn't the one route that they should go down. And so they meet again and they decide to have another debate. Again, the same debate as to what's to be the outcome. But at this point, the ship has already gone to carry out the punishment and to sort out the island. And the debate brings out again. And what's interesting, which is recorded by Thucydides, and as James pointed out earlier, is that Thucydides, although was an eyewitness to lots of things and also went round asking questions for having more of a balanced approach or a scientific approach, as was said, he obviously admits that he makes some of his speeches up, that he can't remember word for word, he can't actually write down and remember everything. So this is a kind of a gist of what the speech was. And we have to bring into account that his feelings and his actual personal attack on Cleon in other parts of his works has to be brought into account as well. So Thucydides records this debate, and he says that actually the Athenians felt that it was a rush decision. And Cleon interestingly says, well, we are a democracy. You made this decision and now you want to change this decision. Where do we stop? Where do we stop making changes? We have debated it as a good democratic state would, and we've carried that out. We can't then go over decisions every time. We need to stick with the decision we originally made. In the end, after the debate actually of Cleon and his decision is the wrong decision, they decide. And they decide to go with the counter argument that only the ringleaders should be brought to justice and they should be in Athens and they should be held accountable. So I've linked this to, again, the idea of modern day events, and this time the British Empire, and the idea of the British Empire doing good for nations, the idea of the British Empire at the time bringing great job prospects, economy, etc., and that this was for the good of Britain and for everybody else. And I just wanted to show this particular image, which I thought was quite a link back to the ancient idea of democracy, where this was where women and children, over 100, were massacred in an uprising against the British Empire and their rule in India. And this later goes on to another uprising, which happens in the empire in Melos, where similar thing happens, but they go down the more harsh treatment with those particular allies that decided to revolt. And they did, in fact, enslave all the women and children and kill men of military age. So there is, as Thucydides had stated, and bringing in James again, that he wanted people to learn from these events, learn from the horrors of war, to learn from mistakes in the future, that this was something that I want to write, not just for now, but for people to realise that these are the mistakes, the horrors of war. This is the bad things that happen. Yet in today and with the empire, we can see that things still are continuing on as they were back in the ancient day. And just to finish off, I just wanted to bring a little bit of art and architecture into it as well. So we often think of Athens being, and this is the kind of the image that is created when we think about Athens, is the idea of art, architecture, and obviously the Acropolis and the Parthenon. And this was, again, in a direct stark contrast to Sparta. Sparta is known for producing very little. If you go to Sparta, there's very little to see, because that was what they were famed on. Whereas in Athens, as we know, they were well renowned for their pottery, their sculpture, for buildings that they left behind. And you can see Pericles of his building program, that I just want to finish on the note that Plutarch notes that the reason for these buildings, which Pericles endorses, is to bring her everlasting glory. And it clearly did, because we're still visiting and we're still talking about art and architecture in the Greek world, especially with Athens today. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Emma. You managed to do Sparta and Athens in pretty much bang on 20 minutes. That's really impressive. And I think, Emma, what you've done just as well as Lloyd did was just to showcase how even if you aren't teaching ancient history, you can use the ancient world to really enrich your teaching of modern history. Before I hand over to Steve, we do have one question in the chat, which I think I will open to all of our panelists. It's a question from Mohammed. Were the Helots the only ethnic Greek slaves in ancient Greece?
Do you want me to? No, there was lots of places where slaves came from. That was just in my particular bit. I wanted to bring those in because that was such a sticking point for the Athenians, especially. Slaves on a mass scale of their own people was something that the Athenians did not feel was a good thing for Greece at all. And so that was one of the reasons why there was such hostility between Sparta and Athens. But there were slaves from other places which were barbarians, or as we've known, they were called that because they were non-Greek and they were captives of war usually.
Thanks, Emma. James.
Yeah, and if I can come in on that, that makes Emma's story about the Mytilene debate even more interesting, because at that point, the Athenians, who are so appalled by the Spartans having Helots, are threatening to enslave all the women and children on the island of Lesbos. And then they go and do the same as well in Milos about 10 years later. So it's a moot point that we do have other ethnic Greek slaves, but that tends to be in extremis, I think.
Brilliant. Thanks to you both. Okay, so we are now on to the final part of today's webinar, and Steve is going to give us an overview of Alexander the Great, who I'm sure even if you don't know anything about him, you will certainly have heard of him. Steve, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Grania. I hope you can hear me okay, because I'm fortunate enough to be in a hotel in Italy on a trip. And Alexander the Great features quite heavily on the trip. One of the great things about teaching the ancient world is that the trips that we offer are particularly inspiring. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to share my screen now and you'll be able to see Alexander the Great. I think coming at this as a modern historian, if you feel more of a modern historian than an ancient historian, I think the wonderful thing about Alexander the Great is it reads like a narrative, and the teaching of the Alexander the Great unit, if you choose to do that, which I taught for 10 years in state schools, it's a narrative. You look at 4 aspects. Alexander's upbringing, including some of his close relationships with friends as a child that then go on to become what are called his companions in the army. That is his right-hand men, his commanders, his generals. You look at a few key battles, not all of the military campaigns, but you look at 3 or 4 in detail. You look at particular points in Alexander's life that stand out, and I'll mention 2 of those in the next 10 minutes. My section is much shorter. And you also look at the structure of the Macedonian army. So just to give you a little bit of background, Alexander the Great, we're talking about his birth in northern Greece in the year 356 BC, so the 4th century BC. So if you go there on the western side to the northern Greek kingdom of Macedon, that's where the story of Alexander begins. Now, I call it the northern Greek kingdom, but we've been talking just now about Athens and Sparta and those other very famous Greek city-states. And they really looked down yards and yards of nose at this northern Greek kingdom of Macedon. They were really quite snobbish about those from Macedon for different reasons. Alexander the Great's father, King Philip of Macedon, he had 7 wives. That was seen to be quite primitive by the Greek city-states standards. They also still had kings in Macedon, which certainly the Athenians viewed as quite primitive. And the Macedonians spoke with a funny accent. So for all sorts of reasons, the northern Greek kingdom of Macedon was not regarded as properly Greek. And then King Philip of Macedon goes to these Greek city-states, defeats them and unites them in what is called the League of Corinth. And he has this dream, having united the Greek city-states, of then going on to conquer eastwards the Persian Empire. For many years, the Greeks had been fighting the Persians because the Persians had been trying to add the Greek city-states to their empire. Philip has this dream, and then Philip is suddenly assassinated. And so his son Alexander inherits Philip's dream, and the League of Corinth, to summarize, travels with Alexander on this epic journey. And the unit follows, really, the story of Alexander. So Alexander's childhood is fascinating. You look at it through 2 writers, the writer Plutarch and the writer Arrian, and Alexander's childhood is portrayed as if it's a harbinger, as if it's predicting his greatness. So the way in which it's written is rich in conversations about how reliable this story is, because of course the writer Plutarch has already decided that Alexander is this great figure, and his childhood clearly points to it. So the stories of his childhood are deliberately chosen to point to his greatness. So then we follow Alexander's journey across the Hellespont, the body of water between Asia and Europe. And Alexander's first stop is an unusual one. He stops at Troy. Now, there really wasn't much in Troy, but of course, Troy was famous for being an immense victory of the Greeks over the Trojans. And Alexander slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow for his whole life. Alexander's copy of the Iliad, which of course is the story written by the Greek writer Homer of this epic battle between the Greeks and the Trojans, was annotated by Alexander himself from his childhood. His teacher was the philosopher Aristotle. And so Aristotle had taught Alexander about the Iliad, and Alexander kept this as a copy under his pillow. So he stays in Troy. He really only visits it to have inspiration, but also to offer to the Trojan gods sacrifices, so that the Trojan gods would be favorable to Alexander, because clearly yet another Greek visiting Troy before he embarks on conquest, he wants to appease the Trojan gods. And then Alexander has his first battle, the Battle of the Granicus on a river. Then he travels to another symbolic destination, the town of Gordium, where there's the legend of the knot that could not be untied, and whoever did untie the knot would rule Asia, which was a metaphor for would rule the world. And Alexander, of course, manages to untie the Gordian knot, much to the joy of his men. I'm not going to tell you how he did it. I'm just going to throw in little details of this story, the narrative of Alexander. And then Alexander finally meets the Persian king. For the very first time at the Battle of Issus, Alexander meets Darius. And just a couple of days ago on the trip that I'm leading at the moment around the Bay of Naples, we saw this mosaic, which is one of the sources in the Alexander the Great unit. We saw this source, this mosaic, in the Naples Archaeological Museum. The mosaic actually came from the floor of one of the houses in Pompeii, so it's very well preserved, and it's now in the museum. And you can see Alexander there on the left on his horse Bucephalus. That's part of the childhood stories. It's a fantastic story for children, the story of the taming of his horse Bucephalus, which pretty much goes with Alexander through all of his campaigns, almost to the end. And you can see there Darius in his chariot on the right. But if you look carefully at this mosaic, Darius's horses are facing in the opposite direction. He's fleeing the battlefield. So Alexander defeats Darius at the Battle of Issus, but Darius escapes to fight another day. And then Alexander travels, and he travels south. You would have thought he'd go to the heart of the Persian Empire. If you find Babylon there in the middle of the map, you thought, why would you not go straight for Babylon, for where Darius has probably gone? And Alexander hugs the coast, and he travels from city to city. And every time Alexander arrives at a city that, of course, is part of the Persian Empire, he liberates that city. He's welcomed as a liberator. If a city submits to Alexander, he treats them well, he liberates them, and on he goes. If a city such as Tyre, if a city does not submit to Alexander, boy, are they in for a shock. And no matter how long it takes Alexander, he will get their honor. They will obey him. They will defer to him. And the story of the siege of Tyre, which lasts for months, is a fascinating story. I'm not going to spoil it. And then he still doesn't travel east to the heart of the Persian Empire. He travels to Egypt, where he founds a city, Alexandria, and then he heads out into the desert, where he visits an oracle. He visits an oracle of the god, Egyptian god Ammon or Amun, from which the pharaoh Tutankhamun took his name. And this oracle of the god Amun predicts, according to the sources, again, reliability is a good conversation here with children, predicts that Alexander is the son of a god, and Alexander's divinity is hinted at. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but another great story. Alexander eventually has his showdown with Darius at the Battle of Gaugamela. And it's at that point that he finally defeats him. But again, Darius leaves the battlefield. He gets a reputation for fleeing when the going gets tough. And in the end, Darius is killed, but not by Alexander. You need to teach Alexander in order to find out what happens. And then, of course, Alexander does travel to the heart of the Persian Empire. He travels to the city of Babylon, and his men, who came from these hilltop towns in northern Macedon, they had never seen anything like the city of Babylon before, of course, with its gold, with its jewels, and its famous hanging gardens. And they wanted to stay in Babylon. But Alexander wants to conquer more. He wants to travel. He wants to see the world. And so he continues east. I'm going to summarize, just in the interest of time. If you go up to the eastern side there, there's a couple of fascinating stories where Alexander has some battles. No two of Alexander's battles are the same, and that's really good for children. They stand out. It's not yet another chariot battle. It's not yet another battle with spears and sarissas. This is where Alexander has to conquer a tribe that are refusing to submit, but they're on the top of a rock, and Alexander would need rock climbing equipment to get to the top. But he manages even to subdue this tribe at the top of the rock. It's at this point that the sources tell us that Alexander fell in love with a lady of absolutely no political importance whatsoever, and it was love at first sight, and he married her, Roxana. Alexander then continues to travel, this time into modern-day India, and he has one of his final battles on the Hydaspes. And at this battle, Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, that has been with him from his childhood, is killed. It's a very sad moment in the Alexander story for children. Alexander is begged by his men, having been away from home for so long, to go home. Or at least can we go back to Babylon and enjoy the spoils of war? Can we live it up a little bit? So Alexander's army splits. Some of them go by sea, which is much faster and straightforward. Alexander chooses to go through the desert, which was a big mistake. He loses some of his army, but eventually he makes his way back to Babylon. And it's during the journey back to Babylon that Alexander loses his best friend. His friend that was with him from his childhood. He was also taught alongside Alexander by the philosopher Aristotle. And according to historians, it's fairly clear that this was Alexander's male lover. He was called Hephaestion. The fascinating thing about the Alexander the Great unit, as well as the narrative that I've summarized there, is also the conversations that you can have that you can't have in lots of other subjects. So subjects such as the role of women, subjects such as human sexuality, the idea of religion, having an open, honest conversation about religion, because Persian religion and Greek religion were very different. And some Greeks laughed at Persian religion, but Alexander respected different cultures and different traditions. So these open conversations that we can have about some quite sensitive subjects come up naturally by studying Alexander the Great. He dies in 323, born in 356, 323 in Babylon. So I would strongly advise, if you do the ancient history units, that Alexander is one of them. I'm going to pause there.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Steve. That was a tantalizing introduction to Alexander the Great. And as you suggested, perhaps if you were to teach it, then you'll be able to find out more about some of those stories. And as Steve said, it is a hugely popular module as part of the GCSE Ancient History qualification. Before we close for today, do we have any final questions? I
can see a question there from Mohammed. It's a good question. Roxana was the daughter of a chief, and the chief was of the Sogdian rock, the battle, the siege of the rock. The historians would suggest that this tribal chief, in terms of the Persian Empire, was of no political importance, quite a minor tribe in the east. If Alexander had married the daughters of Darius or Darius's queen, that would have made political sense, but there wasn't any strategic advantage in marrying the daughter of this tribal chief.
Lovely. Thank you, Steve. Okay, so that sort of brings this webinar session to a close.